I'm so excited to welcome you all to the Writer Center virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. My name is Emily Holland, and I'm thrilled to have Chen Chen joining us as tonight's guest in celebration of his new book, Your Emergency Contact Has Experienced an Emergency. Chen, welcome to the virtual craft chat space.
Hello, it's so good to be here.
So
Thank
great
you
to
for having
virtually
me.
meet you. If you wouldn't mind, would you kick us off with a reading of a couple of poems?
Yeah, absolutely, be happy to. So I was thinking, since there's a series of poems, or a bunch of poems in this new book that are titled after seasons. So there's summer, winter, mainly those two seasons, because I started writing those poems when I was living in West Texas, and it felt like those were the only two seasons, after spending most of my life in New England and being used to four really distinct dramatic seasons. So I was thinking, yeah, I would read some of those season poems, just a couple. So this first one's called Summer. And in case you don't know, Jigglypuff is a Pokemon. It's very round and very pink and sings his enemies to sleep, which I think is lovely. And Jigglypuff evolves into Wigglytuff. So it becomes this more powerful form. So this is called Summer. You are the ice cream sandwich connoisseur of your generation. Blessed are your floral shorteralls, your deeply pink fanny pack with travel-size lint roller just in case. Level of splendiferous in your outfit, 200. Types of invisible pain stemming from adolescent disasters in classrooms, locker rooms, and quite often Toyota Camrys, at least 10,000. You are not a Jigglypuff, not yet a Wigglytuff. Reporters and fathers call your generation the worst, which really means queer kids who could go online and learn that queer doesn't have to mean disaster or dead. Instead, queer means splendiferously you. And you means someone who knows that common flavors for ice cream sandwiches in Singapore include red bean, yam, and honeydew. Your powers are great, are growing. One day you will create an online personality quiz that also freshens the breath. The next day you will tell your father, you were wrong to say that I had to change, to make me promise I would, to make me promise and promise. And this next one is called Winter. This is later on in the book. It's in the middle of the second section, which has more to do with my relationship with my mother. It's called Winter. You become increasingly indoorsy. In the middle of Coco and Tori Amos, you remember your mother calling back once after you hung up on her. She said, you're just like me, saying things you don't mean when you're angry. At the time, you agreed with her, liked being like her, or that she thought, said you were. This afternoon, you believe another nap will solve all your life problems. When everyone knows naps are better suited for tackling geopolitics. In a dream, you try and fail at starting a dream journal over and over. Up again, you make tea, put on some Britney. You stare out the kitchen window, out at the frozen yard, into the wind-faced hill, and you whisper, feel better. Then you think you're saying, no, I meant them, not every word, but every sound. And since it is the season, this is autumn. And there's an epigraph from Basho, translated by Sam Hamill. And it goes, autumn approaches and the heart begins to dream. My heart comes back in a very large FedEx box, as though it has accumulated many new possessions. But no, it is just surrounded by a lavish amount of bubble wrap. Kneeling on the carpet, I lift it out and feel for a moment like I've won a raffle, though I don't recall buying a ticket. Then I bring my heart up to my face and find it giving off a mystery odor, like a relative you want to have to buy a bus, no plane ticket to see. Yet this pounding is undeniably me, demanding a flawless performance of the entire Lion King soundtrack, asking, does the moon ever get sad? Needing to know, does the moon get terribly sad because it is simply called the moon and not some fancy Greek name like the myriad moons of Jupiter, like Callisto, for example, from the Greek Kallistos, superlative form of kalos, meaning beautiful. Then knowing the moon does not get sad, or at least not because of that. Of that, the moon is terribly proud. And I'll read just one more poem. I was thinking about reading the spring poem to complete the cycle, but I think maybe I'll just save that. You can find out for yourself. And I'll just finish with this other poem. I invite my parents to a dinner party. And all you need to know, if you haven't seen the movie Home Alone, it's about burglary and family abandonment, but it's also like a Christmas movie. Yeah, so this references a scene from that movie. I invite my parents to a dinner party. In the invitation, I tell them for the 17th time, the 4th in writing, that I am gay. In the invitation, I include a picture of my boyfriend and write, you've met him 2 times, but this time you will ask him things other than, can you pass the whatever? You will ask him about him. You will enjoy dinner. You will be enjoyable. Please RSVP. They RSVP. They come. They sit at the table and ask my boyfriend the first of the conversation starters I slip them upon arrival. How is work going? I'm like the kid in Home Alone, orchestrating every movement of a proper family, as if a pair of scary yet deeply incompetent burglars is watching from the outside. My boyfriend responds in his chipper way. I pass my father a bowl of fishball soup. So comforting, isn't it? My mother smiles her best, sitting with her son's boyfriend, who is a boy, smile. I smile my hooray for doing a little better, smile. Everyone eats soup. Then my mother turns to me, whispers in Mandarin, is he coming with you for Thanksgiving? My good friend is, and she wouldn't like this. I'm like the kid in Home Alone, pulling on the string that makes my cardboard mother more motherly, except she is not cardboard. She is already exceedingly my mother, waiting for my answer. While my father opens up a Boston Globe when the invitation clearly stated no security blankets. I'm like the kid in Home Alone, except the home is my apartment and I'm much older and not alone and not the one who needs to learn, has to. Remind me what's in that recipe again, my boyfriend says to my mother, as though they have always easily talked, as though no one has told him many times what a non-linear slapstick meets slasher flick meets psychological pit he is now co-starring in. Remind me, he says, to our family.
Thank you so much for reading those poems. I know I had some questions that kind of are connected to some of those, and just the comments in the chat I feel like we could all sit here and listen to you read for the whole night, but we're here to ask some questions. So first, could you just tell us a little bit about who you are, how you came to poetry, and yeah, a little bit just about yourself in your own words.
Yeah, so I loved writing from a pretty early age. I think like since second grade, I knew I wanted to be a writer of some kind. I just had so much fun doing it. I think because no one was telling me to do it or expecting me to do it. So maybe unlike some kids, it wasn't so associated with school. In fact, it always felt like outside of that for me. And so it was just pure fun to create things with words. And so for a while, I wrote fiction, I wrote stories. The world building in them made no sense because it would just like be a mashup of very disparate interests and influences, from like Star Wars to Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And so I often had like witch characters that like lived in Venice because I just was, drawn to Venice. But then sometimes I would like go to space as well, space witches. So yeah, it was pretty chaotic world that they lived in, my characters. And then I guess I just increasingly read really lyrical prose, actually, like when I started reading Virginia Woolf, for instance, or like Alexander Chee's writing. And so I increasingly just became really interested, invested in language itself. And then looking back, I realized, well, I grew up in a multilingual household as well. My parents would speak Mandarin with me. They also spoke Hokkien with each other. And so, like, looking back, of course, that would be formative for my imagination and for my relationship to language. So yeah, but it took a little while. Yeah, I would say later on in college, I started gravitating more and more toward poetry, and then went to grad school, like a million years of grad school for poetry. But yeah, it started from a place of joy and a place of play. And I think that's continued. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I definitely want to see some space witches somewhere, but two, hopefully we'll get to talk about the joy and the play within this collection because I think it's so tactile and forward. So maybe I already see some questions in the chat, but I'll dive in with our first question, which is folks kind of consider it to be our most difficult question, which is what's something that you haven't been asked about your work that you wish you would be, or something that you notice that you do that others don't seem to notice?
Yeah, it is a difficult question. A wonderful one. I feel like I can answer this more readily for my first book, which I'll just mention, has all of these poems that are inspired by French class, like high school French class. I feel like it's something people don't ever really talk about or ask me about, but it's like in a bunch of poems. It's like not just like one or two. To the point where actually I did this reading in I think it was in Houston, where I just read all of the poems from that first book that had like some French connection. Because yeah, I studied it for like 6 years, middle school, high school, did a study abroad program. So it's been, a really important part of like my life. I still read French decently, don't speak it very well at all. at this point. It's very rusty, but yeah, I was just always like tickled that there were all those references in that first book. With the second one, yeah, I'm not sure. I feel like I'm still kind of learning what this book is, as I start to do more readings and discussions based on it. Yeah, I guess, I mean, one thing that I'll mention is just with landscape, how it was unexpected for me that I would be so influenced by landscape. I didn't really think of myself as like a poet of place. And then moving from Syracuse, upstate New York, to Lubbock, West Texas, huge change in many ways, including landscape and climate. So it became really noticeable to me. I think, when you are away, right, from a familiar setting, like you realize how much that familiar setting has informed your work. So yeah, it really got me thinking about the seasons and weather and just different trees, different plants and flowers. And all of that, yeah, came into the poems. But I was surprised. I was like, oh, my surroundings are really important to the writing process, where I used to think, oh, it's just, of the imagination or of memory,
Right.
Personal memory.
Yeah, it's funny how we can surprise ourselves with what we end up seeing in our own work. Like, oh, that is something that's important to me,
right.
Even if it's at the back, maybe the
Right.
subconscious when you're writing. That's great. Thank you. I know there was an earlier question. I think Becca was wondering about music and the influence of music to your writing process, based on some references to different musicians, but also just hearing you read. There was so much sonic play in the soundscapes too.
Yeah, music is so important to me. I feel like I became a poet also because I'm a failed musician. It's not in the cards for me. Yeah, and it's funny because I am always drawn to musicians and always end up dating musicians. So yeah, I think there's something about sound and rhythm that is really important to me. But I also just love putting references in to different musicians and songs in the writing, because I feel that, if it's important, if it's a part of how your mind works, a part of how your heart beats, then, why not put it in a poem? So yeah, there are many, many musical references in these poems. But yeah, I also think about it in terms of like songwriting and composition, and everything, from instrumentation to lyrics. Like that whole creative process also really fascinates me, and I love seeing someone dive into that. And it's also, just a good way to kind of get out of my writer head, which I can be stuck in sometimes, to think about, other art forms, music especially, but also like painting and dance have also been important to me.
Yeah, it's so important. I was just talking with a poet friend about how to overcome like writer's block, and one of those ways is to like kind of absorb yourself with another art form and get yourself thinking in different ways, and restructure the creative process. So that's great.
Yeah, every time I walk through a museum or a gallery, it just, it makes me want to write again.
There's so many great questions in the chat. I probably won't need to ask any of mine. Let me see. Let me scroll back up here. there was a question related to your writing process, which I'm trying to find. Oh, Shaheen, do you let writing come to you, or do you have a structured way of approaching your writing or the page?
Yeah. It depends on the poem. It really does. Sometimes there is something on my mind, a subject that I really want to explore. And actually, I was on a panel recently, and someone pretty much said this, that actually those are the harder poems to write, because it's like I have a subject and I have an idea, but I don't have form. And so it can be really challenging to find the right form to sort of hold and carry that idea. So often I like to just start with a scrap of language or an image, something tonally interesting to me. It could be funny, it could be sad, it can be both. And that really just rattles around in my head for days, and then I have to do something with it. I retweeted recently something that the poet Maya Rufel said that I love. She's one of my favorite contemporary writers. She said, "I don't think I really know what I'm doing as I'm writing. Like I'm not like thinking about it as I'm writing, but it feels like I just need to release this pressure that's built up in my head." And she said, it's sort of like peeing, but from your mind. So I kind of love that. Yeah, so often I don't start with an idea really. It's just like a piece of language that interests me for some reason. I'm curious about it. And that will lead to other lines and other images. And I just try to trust that if I keep following it, it'll become something. But it doesn't have to become something either, right? It can be an experiment. So I try to be really open and receptive to what comes in the process.
Yeah, taking that pressure off of every piece of work that we write is so important too, right? It doesn't all have to end up published or go on to be like our favorite poem ever. I think sometimes we can get in our own way before we even start writing. When we're like, the poem has to be all of these things, but maybe it just wants to be in the end. Well, you mentioned form a little bit, so maybe I'll bring in some of my kind of areas of questioning about the forms that you use in the book, because there's a lot. I mean, the book it's a great long book of poems, and there's elegies, there's odes, there's some epistolary poems, prose pieces. I even kind of spotted like a sonnet type poem. So, and then of course there's some visual play with form as well. So could you talk about just how you approached form for this book in particular, and where that came to you in your process, and how you generally approach form in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the main things I wanted to challenge myself to do with this book is experiment more with syntax. Because my first book uses a lot of anaphora, so the repetition at the beginning of lines or sentences. And I really embraced that. Like I leaned into it completely. And then like every review of the book was like, oh, he uses a lot of anaphora. Like it was like really positive kind of response, but it was definitely like something people picked up on, which I'm like, okay, yeah, it is a feature of that book. But then it did get me thinking further about sentences and wanting to start sentences in some different ways. So that was like actually a big craft focus for me, is sort of pushing the sentence in some other directions. And so there's this form in the book with actually the season poems. They're all in these sort of like prose blocks. And for the most part, it just moves sentence by sentence. So there's like a sentence stanza and then another sentence stanza. And that was inspired by, various poets, but in particular, Sarah Gambito, is this poem called Toro that's in that form. But also, yeah, a lot of prose poems, like some of what Claudia Rankine does in Citizen and her other books. And so, yeah, I just really wanted to push the sentence. But yeah, there are some other forms, yeah, sonnets or sonnet-like poems. And I feel like people are surprised sometimes how into sonnets I am, because I tend to be a more expansive writer in such a, compressed form. But I think that's what appeals to me about it, is having to work within that restraint, right? You have to get really creative when it's not like your natural tendency. And I like the tension also between how expansive I get and having to like fit it into this tight space of the sonnet. I learned so much from reading and studying sonnets and trying to write them. So yeah, that's been a form that's been really, I've been really interested in. And I'll just mention one other form, which came out of a workshop assignment that was really frustrating to me initially. So it was, I have a poem in here, it's also in sort of a sonnet form, but it's anagrams. So the letters, like the word bank that I have for that poem is just the letters of the title, which is Chen, no middle name, Chen. So it came out of this workshop prompt to write like an anagram poem using only the letters in your name. And I was like, this is so unfair because my name is Chen Chen. And so I literally have 4 letters. So I could do like hen, he, like there weren't many options. And so then when I remembered that growing up on like class rosters, my name would sometimes show up with like the no middle name part. So then I used that. And then it became really fun because I had more vowels, sort of like a Wheel of Fortune, can I buy a vowel? So I had many more words to choose from. And actually it was almost more fun to just keep generating the word bank. And it was just like, oh, I can write Dahlia now with these letters. How cool is that? So that's something, yeah, maybe to try out as a prompt, like just use the letters of your name, use your middle name or use no middle name if need be, if you need more letters. Yeah.
Yeah, I loved that poem. And it's really interesting to think of like the 2 layers of restraint, like the anagram prompt, but then the fact that it takes the form of the sonnet, which is also a kind of exercise in restraint.
Yeah.
And the sound play that comes with just the fact that you have to recycle the same letters over and over was really fun to keep going back to. So yeah, I can see that being an interesting workshop exercise. Maybe I'll take that to my class. I think I have some students in the audience. So if they see that exercise, they know where it comes from. There's so many wonderful questions. Diamond is asking, can you speak more on the importance of distance to writing and the writing process, not just physical distance, but temporal distance or personal distance?
Right. That's a wonderful question. Yeah, especially with this new book. I feel I might have finished it earlier, but there were many emotional challenges. One of them being returning to the poem set in Lubbock, Texas, because after moving, I was, in a different headspace and in a different, literal environment space. And so part of me didn't want to go back, because when I lived there, it was, there are some really lovely aspects of it. I made some really great friends. and learned a lot in the program that I was in, but it was also very isolating and lonely to be there, especially as a queer person. And so, yeah, it was important to find like these pockets of community while I was there. But I also wrote a lot out of that loneliness. And so going back to that emotion was tricky. I'm like, I don't want to exist in that emotion all the time. So yeah, it took some distance. So there was a very early version of this book that was my PhD dissertation, which I finished at the end of 2018. But I knew that, so even though it was like in a manuscript form and it was like a full-length book, I knew that it would change pretty significantly because I wanted to write some other things, particularly more poems that weren't set in Lubbock, but could also be in conversation with those Lubbock poems. So I just let myself write new stuff pretty much for like 2 years. So in 2019 and 2020. And then summer of 2020, I also wrote started to write the pandemic pieces that are in here in the third section. And that came out of actually prose editors asking me to write things because I couldn't do it in poems initially. So I was really grateful for that opportunity to kind of shift genre a bit. But yeah, so the distance involved writing some other things so that I could return to the older poems in a newer way.
Yeah, that's great. And it's nice to hear sort of the way that a book, like maybe all the poems can evolve just based on the new poems that come into it, given the time and the subject matter. And yeah, I really appreciate it. I felt like every piece, no matter what maybe place we were in temporally, was just perfectly in conversation with the other ones, especially some of the newer pieces that are directly referencing this pandemic that we are still living through. So that sort of ongoing conversation aspect as well. All right, let's go back into the chat. This is so great. Okay, Emily, not me, a different Emily is saying you have some crazy and lovely similes in your first book, and you have some amazing similes in your new book as well. Do these just come to you, or do you have a process of generating these?
Yeah, again, it depends on the poem. I think, yeah, there are times when it comes really naturally, which is great. And there are other times where I recognize the need for more figurative language or for something stranger to happen. But it can't be forced either. So sometimes I just have to wait for the right, simile, metaphor, image to come along. Sometimes that can take a while. And I'll say that usually if it takes a while, like, yes, it's like a craft issue, a formal issue, but I think at the end of the day, it's really some kind of emotional issue that I haven't thought through or felt through the core emotion of the poem yet. Like, that's not clear to me yet. And so there can be a bit of a block if I'm not willing to go there fully. And this is something I'm always telling my students this, that it's like you can write a perfectly competent poem, right? Like on a technical level, but then what will make it really shine and be this engaging piece of writing is that emotional attentiveness, which like takes some vulnerability, whether, you know, you write autobiographically or not, right? It could all be imagined, but I think there has to be that kind of emotional foundation. So sometimes when I go back to revise, it's less about like words, and more about like, have I actually gone there, right? With what I sort of like promised myself to do, right, at the beginning of a poem.
Yeah, that checking in with yourself through the process. Yeah,
And
I
that can
like
be
that.
scary because you might not know what'll come up. I know poet Jericho Brown talks about this all the time, that you want the language to start like doing some things on its own that reveal things to you, where like the poem gets to be smarter than you are ultimately. And you're surprised, which I think is always a good sign in the process. Yeah, surprise yourself.
Yeah, that's so important to keep in mind too, just in approaching the page and letting your emotions come through. It can be hard and scary for sure, but we feel it in your work, especially. Let me go back to some questions here. I'm going to jump to one of mine. I was really interested in sort of some of the extended types of poems that we see, like the school poems. And then of course, in that second section, we get those small book of questions, and they seem kind of concerned with these different ways that the speaker is moving through like modes of learning and about family, friends, maybe even poetics, relationships, grief. So could you talk a little bit about maybe those forms and how they functioned for you writing them, and maybe what they taught you?
Yeah, I used to not be able to really write sequences because I would feel too boxed in by the concept. You know, I'd write maybe two that were like companion poems, but then I couldn't go on because I felt really stifled. And then just wanted to write something very different from that. So that's changed over time, where now I'm really drawn to sequences. And I think that comes from just letting it be a looser structure, where like in this book, it mainly happened through titles. Titles and thinking about form, but still keeping it really open. So yeah, they're the season poems. They're all in that like sentence stanza structure that I mentioned. And then they're the school of poems, like the School of Joy, the School of Logic, the School of Australia is one of them. And those are in like regular stanza forms. So like quatrains or tercets, etc. And so those are like the basic constraints I gave myself. And then with the School of Poems, I was also thinking, yeah, as you said, like about learning and how true learning is sometimes or often at odds with institutions of education. So I was thinking a lot about that. And as I said, being in grad school for a long time and becoming more of a teacher as well in recent years, and thinking about, what do I kind of want to pass on? And what kinds of knowledge do I want to share, or curiosities I want to share? So some of that like classroom experience came into those poems as well. But again, yeah, it had to be like, I didn't know how many of each I would write. I didn't think ahead about the order in which they would appear in the book. I just let that all happen later, and just was like, oh, if I feel like writing another season poem or another school up poem, that's great. And I'll just briefly say about the sequence in the second section, Small Book of Questions. So that started out as a lyric essay that I wrote for a nonfiction workshop. And there was actually a friend of mine, Jess Smith, poet, essayist, who suggested that I put it in this manuscript because she was like, it's so thematically relevant to everything else that you're exploring, but also like the writing is quite lyrical. And then it became a matter of like breaking it into those chapters, because originally it was just one essay. So then that became interesting because then I was like, oh, I have this opportunity to like interrupt the sequence with other poems, and sort of like jump to another time, another memory, another place. But yeah, so that sequence is organized around Bonu Kapil's questions from her book, The Vertical Interrogation of Strangers. It's like this set of 12 questions, and they're super generative. I love teaching with them as well. They're like these huge, impossible questions, like who are you and whom do you love? It's the first one. There's one that's, what do you remember about the earth? Which is like such a weird perspective shift. My favorite is who is responsible for the suffering of your mother? And that one I just kept coming back to. But yeah, I highly recommend looking at the questions as a way to open up your writing.
Yeah, because there's a way, even if you repeat questions, you can get at something different with a different answer, right? They're not really answers. It's like a lyric exploration of what it means or the feeling and the emotions. And I love that element of surprise and sort of kind of upending expectations when you read, and moving through those sections was really lovely and well structured. And yeah, I'm always intrigued with these kind of lyric essay modes that I think can do so much and reframe so much within the book too. So let me go back to our questions, check the time. We are doing great. Thank you everyone for your questions here. There's been a few questions about kind of publishing and things like that. So I wanted to ask, maybe if you could talk about your experience between your first book and your second book, and then also how you approach publishing individual poems, and maybe the role of rejection for a young poet, and how you overcome that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been very lucky in publishing. I mean, I still get rejections, including like work that's been solicited, which is always a fun experience where like you get asked to send something and then they're like, no thanks. But I think the difference for me now is like it used to like crush me into a fine powder to be rejected, and I would like totally question my life. I'd be like, should I be a writer even? And it would take me a while, like it would take me a month or 2 months to really get back to it, or send something out again. But these days, so I think it's I still experience rejection. It's still a total bummer. Like that doesn't go away. But I dwell on it less. Like I might have like a day where it makes me sad instead of a whole month. And on that day, I'll be very gentle with myself and eat some cake, or do something nice for myself. And then the next day return to things. So yeah, I'm glad that it's shifted in that way. Because in the past it would be kind of paralyzing. So yeah, I'm very sympathetic about the submission process and rejection, because it can be really hard and demoralizing at times. So at one point, like during my MFA, I remember talking to a writer friend and her saying that like what she started to do was for every rejection, she would send out 3 more submissions. and just like kept things moving along so that you don't kind of dwell too heavily, right, on any one place or, you know, set of poems. But you just keep circulating. And so I adopted that approach to some extent. And that worked really well, because you might get, you know, several rejections, but then you'll get, you know, an acceptance or two also. And so it feels like it balances out more. But yeah, I think it's hard. So I always recommend kind of keeping the two processes separate, the writing versus the submitting of the work. Because I think if you're thinking too much about the publication side of it, that can overly influence like what you're trying to write. And I think it's just hard to predict anyway what people are going to like of your work. I've been surprised over and over by like what gets accepted or like how it's received, how it's read. Like the poems of mine that have become more known from my body of work at this point, I could not have guessed that those would be the poems. Like some of them, I don't have like a strong memory of even writing. So it's really funny to me because like from the writer's side, it's like, of course you remember like the most arduous ones where you really had to like think about things or like do more research and come back to it. So like those are the ones that like I feel very close to because of how much it took to write them. Yeah, so I would advise against like trying to write toward a publication or, you know, toward an editor's taste, because you actually don't really know what they might really embrace. Yeah.
And it's, I mean, I feel like editors are always changing.
Exactly.
Trends are always changing. It's, I think early on in my poetry writing, I was like, okay, I'm seeing these things happening. Let me write something like that. And then I wonder why it doesn't go anywhere. I'm like, that's not my writing. Like I shouldn't write like that because it's not me. So yeah, that's so helpful to think about. And it is surprising sometimes when you get an acceptance, you're like, oh, that's the poem out of all of the.
Yeah,
That's the one.
that happens all the time. Yeah.
And you're like, someone get my favorite one already. Like, so it's helpful framing and helpful to know that we're all still out here getting rejections and making it through. You also work as an editor yourself. So I wanted to touch a little bit on that. Your project on Twitter, the Lickety Split, which is so fun. I'm particularly drawn to because it's such a brief form, but I feel like your poetry style is almost this kind of maximalist verse. So could you talk a little bit about how that experience has been for you and what a poem can do in a tweet?
Yeah, I mean, it very much started as a pandemic project because I was like, well, I'm online all the time. So I might as well try to make it a more positive experience, especially on Twitter, which can be a mess. So yeah, I wanted to do something kind of affirming with the space. And I've always loved short poems, minimalist poems, really spare poems. They're very hard for me to write, but I love reading them. So I was like, well, I'm on Twitter. I want to like contribute something in the poetry discourse that, yeah, is just very direct. You know, like here are poems and you can share them really easily. And yeah, to do something like, because it publishes basically every weekday. There's some months I take breaks. but it just feels nice to like flood the timeline with poems. And I learned so much as an editor from reading submissions. I learned a lot about just like what's going on in the contemporary landscape. You know, what are some trends? What are subjects that people keep returning to at this time? And then with, you know, the tweet-sized poem, right, 280 characters, including spaces. It's like so impressive to me what people do in that really tight space. So it's like I publish poems that are like in stanzas, you know, or doing something weird with the visual formatting. And that can happen within a tweet. So that's been so cool to see and be able to support.
Yeah, I think the timeline could always use more poems. And it's really fun to read just how much can be packed in so few, not even words, so few characters. It's really fun. I want to make sure we have time to talk a little bit about maybe if you had some craft advice. I saw a question earlier about maybe something you return to or something you teach as far as a way to approach craft with poetry.
Yeah, something I keep thinking about. I just taught a week-long workshop and was talking to the students in that workshop about this idea. So again, Mary Ruffel says this great thing, I think in one of her essays for Madness, Rack and Honey, where she says that like a poem starts to feel alive, not when the lines speak to you, nor to someone else, like a reader, but to each other. The lines are conversing with one another. There's a kind of internal logic that they create. Like that to me is like when I know a poem's starting to really click, and it's like this kind of magical feeling. And it's like very exciting. But that's like one of the best ways I can describe it is from Ruffel. The lines are speaking to each other. And so that's something to do with like pattern making, right? The kind of tapestry that you're weaving together on the linguistic level, on the semantic level, on the syntactical level. Basically, yeah, when it's like sort of firing all cylinders. And there's that sense of like cohesion that's still surprising, right? Like how the elements come together. I also share those with a different group of students, but I recently became kind of obsessed with this Japanese ice skater who just retired, Yuzu Hanyu, who's incredible. I was watching some of his like Olympic gold performances and they're just electrifying. They're completely like riveting. And I was like that sense of movement where it's like so fluid and then like surprising sort of turn. I'm like, this is what a poem should feel like. It's like this ice skating performance. So I think like I also recommend finding some equivalent of that for you, whether it's in an art form, you know, it could come from like cooking or photography, right? Any range of things, where when you like witness it, when you experience it, you feel completely charged by it. And that can be a really good indicator for when you're looking at your own work, right? The kind of thrill that you want.
Yeah. Yeah, the way it can set your soul on fire and really inspire different movements, even over mediums. Yeah, that's really important. Well, to wrap up, because unfortunately we are almost out of our hour, which is so sad. I wanted to turn back to talk about joy. So there's so much joy kind of seeping through the lines in this collection. So I wondered, what brings you joy right now, or what's exciting you? Maybe poetry related, or can be anything.
Yeah, so my partner and I just moved to Rochester, New York, where we've lived before, briefly. So it's not unfamiliar, but we're kind of rediscovering the place. And today, we were walking on this beach off Lake Ontario, and then nearby was this arboretum. And I was like, this is so beautiful. And it made me realize like how much I missed just having, after living in more of like a city, being that close to nature, right? That we can just really easily access the water and the trees, and be in this really quiet space. And that feels really rejuvenating. And there's something about just being completely dwarfed by nature that I love, when you're in the presence of like this lake that just goes on and you can't see all of it. All right, it's sort of not available to you in that way. But there's something about that vastness that feels really embracing, actually, where you're like, oh, this is out of my control, right? But in a way that doesn't freak me out. Instead, it's like the opposite, right? There's something like sustenance about it. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Chen. Everyone, please buy a copy of Your Emergency Contact Has Experienced an Emergency. Purchase link is back in the chat. Chen, it was wonderful to talk with you. I wish we had more time so we could get to all the multiple questions that everyone had. But thank you so much for your time tonight. And thank you everyone for coming.
Yeah, thank you everyone. Thank you for your questions. This was so wonderful.